Welcome to Impostor Hour with Liz and Greg. We're here to explore the imposter syndrome that haunts creatives, delving into how it affects their lives and work. Join us as we chat with authors and artists about creativity, self-doubt, featuring imposter characters in their stories, and the occasional imposter who pops up in their day-to-day lives.
And today we are so excited to welcome Cleyvis Natera to the show. Cleyvis is a novelist, essayist, and critic, and author of Neruda on the Park, a New York Times Editor's Choice and International Latino Book Awards silver medalist, selected by Malala Yousafzai for her literary book club. Her work appears in the New York Times Book Review, Time, the Washington Post, the Kenyon Review, and many more. A 2024 Toni Morrison Fiction Fellow and Voices Rising Fellow, she teaches at Barnard and Montclair State, where she's helping launch a bilingual MFA program. Her new novel, The Grand Paloma Resort, released last month and is available everywhere. Welcome, Cleyvis. We're so excited to have you.
I'm so happy to be here with both of you, Greg and Liz. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you.
And I will just say I had the privilege of putting together your bio, and wow, I had to edit it down. You have so many incredible credits and programs and experiences and awards. And I just, as I was trying to figure out, what to say and keep it succinct, I was just really struck by, this amazing, wonderful career you've had. And I want to hear how it started, because it seems like you've accomplished so much and not in a very long period of time.
Well, thank you. I mean, I appreciate you saying those very kind words. What's so interesting to me, Liz, is that everything that you just read that I've accomplished has happened in the last 7 years. I graduated from my MFA program just about 20 years ago. And, I tried to stand up a writing career at that point. I had a literary agent. We couldn't sell my first book that I had written out of my MFA program. And then I had another agent that couldn't sell it. And at the time, I was working a full-time corporate job in an insurance company. And, I kept trying. I mean, I would apply for certain things, and it just wasn't happening. I couldn't get an agent for many years. So at a certain point, I just decided to put the writing in the background and focus on my career in corporate America and focus on giving birth to kids. And, I got married. So it wasn't until about, 7 years ago that I decided to come back with an earnest. And I was like, writing or bust. And so everything that you've read in that bio really just happened over the course of the last few years. And I would also say that most of those opportunities, the fellowships and a lot of the grants, I've always been told no first. I mean, even my agent that I have now also passed on my book on Neruda on the Park the first time. And so that's one of the things that I always tell people, especially my graduate students, that when you hear people reading these accolades and you're like, wow, that's amazing. It's like, you never know how many times someone was told no before, the whatever that signifier of success is that shows up.
Now, have I heard you in other conversations, though, mention that you were kind of working on Neruda on the Park in that 20-year span, kind of over those years? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, the whole journey, once that first book, my thesis, was rejected, I moved on to Neruda on the Park. And from the first sentence to publication, it was a 15-year journey.
Wow. Okay.
And it wasn't consecutive, right? Because there were several years when I put the book aside and wasn't working on it. Sure. But it in total, it was a 15-year journey. Yeah.
Okay.
Wow. And so you are working on Neruda in the Park for, 15 years all told. And then with Grand Paloma, did you sell it kind of in the course of that? Was it a 2-book deal? What was the timing on that? Because I feel like you wrote that in a much shorter period of time.
Well, yeah, you know how they say it's like you're out on your luck, and then all of a sudden everything changes. For the Grand Paloma Resort, I actually sold that book as a proposal, so I hadn't finished writing it. And my editor, the editor who acquired Neruda on the Park, it was really fortunate for me because in 2023, Neruda on the Park had been out for a year. and she hadn't bought any fiction. And she was like, "What are you working on? What do you have?"
Mhm.
And at the time, I was revising my thesis book that I had been working on because it's my little baby and I wanted to see the light of the world at some point. But I had also been working on a collection of short stories that I started working on during the pandemic in 2020. And so, in 2023, I had like about 150 pages worth of fiction that I had written as part of that, but it was all short stories. And when I spoke to my editor about the story of these employees who are just up to no good at this luxury resort, at that point, the White Lotus had become this phenom, right, globally. And, there were definitely a lot of synergies between this book that I was writing and then this show. And she was very interested. And when I spoke to my agent about it and we put together the proposal and some sample chapters, he gave me some very sound advice, which was, you just make a lot less money if you sell it as a collection of short stories. And I felt like I could still do what I wanted to do with the book, even if it was changed to a more traditional novel. And so it was just really interesting because I went from like this 15 years, such a painful journey with my first book. And then the second book, it was really quite simple. I mean, we gave it to my editor. She loved the proposal and she bought it. And the whole thing happened like in the course of a few weeks.
Right. And you, sorry, I blanked out. I had a question. I completely blanked out. Here we are. No, sorry. Okay. Yeah. White Lotus. You mentioned White Lotus now. And I noticed when I was reading, Grand Paloma, you kind of Easter egg in this line where one of the characters is talking about, a TV show that's kind of similar to what's going on with a resort, and I love how you did this. She says like, any show, I think she tries to watch the first episode and she's turned off because she's like, the idea that any show around a resort would have the like guests as the most compelling characters is kind of absurd. And so it kind of puts her off of it. And I love that framing device for the book. Is that something like when you went into this, did you have that as a clear idea that this would really more or less rotate around the staff and the help?
Yeah, I mean, I started writing the book years before the White Lotus was a show,
Right.
and I actually have several short stories that were published in 2020. And so, I thought that it was just really interesting because what I anticipated would happen with my book is that everyone would assume that it was me riffing off of the show,
Right.
even though I had started writing the show years before the show came online.
Right.
And so I just wanted to have a little bit of fun. It was
Yeah.
a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek moment where I was like, you know what? Everybody's gonna think I'm like stealing this idea, but actually what I'm most interested in is actually the staff. I'm interested in the underside of privilege and class. And so even though I'm a huge fan of the White Lotus, I mean, I binge the show like the best of them,
Sure.
but I do think that my book is quite different from it.
Well, it's interesting too. So, sorry, Liz, I just wanted to kind of follow up quickly on that because one of the things that I found really compelling in the book is the sort of dynamic between the two sister characters, between Elena and Laura. And what you were talking about, sort of capitalism, corporatism, and that sort of the sort of underside of that, and the machinery behind that. And one of the things that I thought was a really interesting sort of point of narrative tension becomes this thing between Elena, who's embracing this sort of pushback activist mindset, and then Laura, who's more kind of like working from within the system and sort of appreciating the sort of relative fortune that someone in her position has sort of like worked into in this framework. I don't know if you could just kind of talk about that dynamic. I thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who grew up with very little money in my life, and then I got to be an executive in a corporate company,
Right.
I feel like I had that sense, as Laura has, that I just felt like very fortunate, to have had kind of like this vehicle for social mobility in my life. And the fact is that, like Laura, I had drank the Kool-Aid, the corporate America Kool-Aid that tells you this is how you're able to meet your dreams. Right. And so, we find these two sisters, they love each other fiercely, but they're at odds with each other.
Yeah.
Because Laura really, they both kind of want to leave the resort. They're both like Afro-Latinas in in a country and in a place that doesn't treat darker skinned people very well,
Right.
you know? And so even though they both have this kind of desire to leave the resort, to leave the country of the Dominican Republic, they both think very differently about what their obligation is to the community around them. And I felt like this vehicle of like ambition and upward mobility would be like a great way to show that mindset difference, because Laura, in some ways, she feels like fortunate that this career has enabled her a path outside and upwards, where like her sister has benefited from, you know, because Laura is like middle management. She has somehow hustled for her little sister, who's only 17 years old, to go to the Global Academy. She has this education that is really Western and quite elite.
Right.
And what Elena has ended up with out of that is this activist mindset. Like, we should be trying to uplift the community that we're a part of. We should be trying to right these social wrongs, and largely because she has been brought up in like a very different circumstance from her sister. So I thought that would be just really combustible and a lot of tension between the sisters, and give the book a lot of the tension that it ends up exposing about what it means to be like of the same class, but living like really different lives that lead to really different mindsets.
Yeah.
Well, and you talked about tension, and one of the things that really stood out for me was this, you know, the momentum of this book compared to your first one. I mean, it's a genre shift for you. You know, while your first book was gorgeous and literary and such a strong sense of place and characters, you know, this book falls within the mystery thriller territory. And I'm wondering, you know, knowing now that you adapted this from short stories, was that intentional? Did you have a wish to do that? Were you writing into a certain moment? Tell us how you went from one to the other.
Yeah, well, I mean, knock me over with a feather, okay? Because when people started calling it a thriller, I was like, say what? Right. Yes, you know? I mean, I definitely wanted the book to be very suspenseful. And one of the things that, you know, for me as a literary writer, I've always thought about structure and character as really the vehicles that move a story forward. And with my first book, I mean, the subject matter, right? Like what I like to think of as like the content of that book was really like a tension between like two generations. And also this idea of like ease and pleasure as a vehicle for one character to find freedom or find herself. And so like that book had to be slow in some ways, because so much of what it was kind of thinking or centrally concerned with was like the idea that, you know, for some people, especially women who have grown up with like less means, the idea of even resting and sleep is like crazy, you know, like a crazy idea. And when I started thinking about turning, I mean, even as short stories, this book had a lot of tension, because my whole point was, you know, when I was thinking about what's going to be the engine that makes the book move, for me, like a lot of what I was considering was, this is a labor book. It's a book that is centrally concerned with work. And what I want is for readers who pick up this book to not be able to stop doing their job, which is to read. And so I was thinking a lot about like, how do I hook the reader? How do I create a series of escalating crises with this kind of like devastating question in the center that you would not get an answer until almost the end. And so, you know, I wasn't as intentional in shifting into a thriller or a suspense genre. My editor and I actually talked quite a lot about that, and the book isn't labeled as a thriller because I certainly am not familiar with a lot of those conventions. And I felt like if a diehard thriller reader picks up this book thinking it's a thriller book, they might be disappointed, because what I wanted it to do was, through the structure of the book, for the suspense to be driving it. And so my concern, I think, was still like rooted in like my literary education, but really thinking about that device as stemming both from structure and stemming from character development. But I'm just so happy that people are calling it that, because I'm like finding a lot of readers, and I'm kind of like loving this idea that I've almost stumbled into this genre. Right. It wasn't as intentional.
Well, that gets me curious about this, because there is that delineation, I think, and sometimes it's readers, sometimes it's just the industry in the way that, you know, the publishing house or like the marketing team places your book, right? But there's sort of this divide, I think, often in people's heads or in people's estimations of things between like what you would call literary fiction and the more genre forward stuff. And I recently heard you in an interview say something that I thought was fascinating. You said, some of the things I'm better at are things you're not supposed to do if you want to be taken seriously as a writer. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think that a lot of writers, you know, deal with that mindset.
Yes, I mean, I am a reader first, and I think that, so much of like the love I have for literature comes from the fact that, I grew up in a house where there was a lot of violence. I grew up in a house where there was just like a lot of difficult times. And so when I started reading, like reading for me really was an escape. And reading for me as a child, I was maybe like 12 or 13 years old when I really first started reading with a lot of passion. It really helped me like to find my way in the world, to situate myself in the world in like this really meaningful and powerful way. And what's so strange is that then, when I was, I took writing classes in college, and those were just for fun. I mean, like I was trying to be like Anne Rice and Stephen King. So maybe I do have some roots, like some suspenseful and thrillers, because I was eating up everything Stephen King was serving, But like when I got to my graduate program, the shift was really marked about like what is supposed to happen in literary fiction as like a study of human existence. And it's really like this kind of slower, thoughtful, introspective way of telling stories. And honestly, when I think back about the fact that I never sold that first book, largely is because I think that book didn't move. The book was written beautifully and it was concerned with beautiful questions, but it just didn't have like compelling characters or like a car that moved. And so I think that it really was because I faced so much failure and rejection as I was trying to make it. Even though I had been told, right, from my professors in graduate school that I was so talented and whoever read my writing would be like, undoubtedly you will make it. The fact is that I didn't make it with writing the books that I was taught to write. And so for me, it really meant divorcing myself of this idea and like the goals that I had in terms of what it means to be a serious writer. Because at one point I did realize that the books I want to write and the books I want to read aren't quiet books. They're not books that move slowly. They're not books that have people who are individuals concerned with their own journeys. They're books that are going to be centrally concerned with community, that are going to be looking at people who are sexual and who are funny and who, are making really terrible decisions. And so if that means, in some ways that I'm going to be cast out of like literary fiction, then I'm okay with that. And I had to, to kind of come to terms with the idea that to write the books I would want to read from myself and that I want to offer the world means writing books that don't always bend into the conventions of literary fiction.
Does that philosophy come to any tension when you're teaching? Do you feel like kind of restricted or hemmed in by certain expectations in MFA programs, or have you been able to kind of integrate that fluidity or flexibility of thinking?
No, I mean, I think, listen, things have moved and changed a lot in the last 20 years in MFA programs. I mean, I do have to say that, I'm invited constantly to teach. I have such a good reputation as a teacher because I'm just like really, I think I'm just really down to earth and sometimes a little, people sometimes think I'm a little bit blunt with like the advice I give them. But my whole thing is, listen, you can be a great writer, and I've judged so many prizes. I've judged so many competitions, so many fellowships in the last 5 years. And I have to tell you that like so often I see writers who are just beautiful writers, but whose writing is just like dead. It's boring. It doesn't have life in it. And so I think that one of the things that I find that makes me a really good teacher now is that I am able to talk about what we should all be striving is excellent fiction, right? So just because I want the fiction to move and characters to be thorny and messy, and I want to write about sex, I want to write about interesting, really fraught moral dilemmas, that doesn't mean that my writing is any less than it was when I was in graduate school. I mean, I still am meticulous about my sentences and I'm meticulous about my language. And so, what I'm trying to teach my students is you shouldn't be sacrificing one for the other, but you should know what you want out of this career, because if you want a National Book Award, a Pulitzer, you have to read the books that are winning those prizes. And more often than not, those books aren't the kind of books that I'm writing.
Yeah.
And so, I think that people just need to understand that, like, there are conventions. And if you want to be a writer who is on a certain path, you have to decide whether or not you're going to, follow those conventions. And those are your choices. But if you take a workshop class with me, I'm going to tell you what's wrong with your book. And I'm going to help you to write a better book. Because I'll be damned if somebody leaves my class and is writing some dead boring thing,
In terms of the MFA stuff, we mentioned this sort of glancingly in the bio on the intro, but at Montclair State, you are in the process of sort of developing a bilingual MFA program. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And what is that? Is there sort of a precedent for that? Is that happening a bit in higher education, or are you sort of like pushing that program? Is that something that you're really developing?
Yeah, so they hired me to come in to develop this program because our provost, who sadly is just about to leave from Montclair State University, came from Texas.
Okay.
And there's like the only bilingual program in the whole country that is offering a bilingual MFA. And so, we're very excited about it. Right now, this is my second year in the program, working at the university. And we got through the first layer of approvals. I mean, my goodness, let me tell you, as someone who worked in corporate America, I used to think we were dysfunctional. You go into academia and you're like, academia is a whole new animal. So, it took us like a year to get through like internal approvals. We got like through the provost council got approval. Then now we're working on getting state level certification because it is a public school. Okay, right. And the provost now left, so we don't even know who's gonna take the program up for approval. That's to be determined. And the other thing is that the climate in this country has changed drastically in the last year. And so even the idea now of like having a program that is as compelling of an idea as it is, because Montclair State University is something like 40 or 50% Hispanic serving. One of the questions out there in the world is whether or not even that designation is going to exist in the future, because it is tied to a government designation, it's tied to grants and aid. And so, I am very fortunate because the people at Montclair State are very supportive still of the idea. And I think there's more to be supportive, because I think there's really a very compelling reason to celebrate bilingualism and to celebrate this kind of hybridity. But I mean, I don't really know what's gonna happen between now and next year. So we're going to keep, my whole point is I was hired to do this job. I'm trying to do the best job I can so that I have an MFA program right in my backyard, because I'm from Montclair in New Jersey. I think that the students that come would be incredible, and the work that we could produce would be incredible. But I also understand that the climate has changed drastically and that it just might not be the right timing for it.
Well, I wonder too, that ties right back into your book, which one of the themes in there is birthright citizenship. Did you have a sense going in when you were writing the story of like how prescient you were writing into the moment, or was this something that just sort of happened?
No, I mean, let me tell you something, Greg. This is one of the things that I tell my students all the time. It's like, if you write the truth, it will always be like relevant in some powerful way. I mean, I grew up in the Dominican Republic, and I grew up in a place where Haitian people are really the underclass in the Dominican Republic. And so regardless of if you are a black Latino, or if you are a white presenting Latino, it doesn't matter. Like, really, like, the underclass of this country is people from Haiti. And so it was really interesting to me that as I was growing up, when I went to college, I had this kind of racial awakening myself because, in the United States, it's very different than it is now. Like back then, we didn't have Afro-Latinidad or like this kind of pride in being descendants of Black people as Hispanic people, right? It was like very clearly marked. You were either a Hispanic person or you were a Black person. And in college, my best friends were Caribbean. My best friends were African American people. And I had this moment where I looked around and I was like, I might be Black. And my friends were like, have you had a mirror before, Cleyvis? Because for anyone who's listening and can't see me, I am like a brown skinned person and not light brown, right? And so it was just really interesting to me that solidarity with like a Black diaspora coincided with me reading Edwidge Dantica's The Farming of Bones, which is a book that talks about, the Parsley Massacre that happened in the Dominican Republic in 1937. Tens of thousands of Haitians were murdered at the mandate of the government. Dictator Trujillo was in power back then. And so, one of the things that happened to me as I started traveling back to the Dominican Republic is that I started to see what was happening to Haitian people. And I think that like it affected me greatly, A, because I had read this one book, and B, because I felt in solidarity with Black people. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know that had I stayed in the Dominican Republic or had I not had the experience I had when I went to Skidmore College, that I would have had that kind of like sense of being in solidarity with those folks. And so it's really interesting that, as I've gone back to the Dominican Republic, in the last 10 years, Dominicans of Haitian descent have lost their birthright citizenship in my country. In the last few years, the situation has escalated to the point where now there's like mass deportations happening. And so, when I decided that I was going to write this second book and it was going to be set in the Dominican Republic, I didn't think there was any way I could write it without writing about that history and without writing about the tensions that exist. And I wanted to do it, though, because my book isn't a history book. And I'm honestly not interested in writing a historical fiction book. I knew that it had to be relevant only through the lens of these characters, and that it would be kind of harsh to think about the fact that, my main protagonist couldn't care less about what's happening to mass deportations, right? Like she's not concerned about that. She's concerned about her and her sister and their path to freedom. And I also thought that would be like an interesting way to like confront the history of a place through like the present mindset of people. And so it's been really interesting, honestly, because now here we are in the United States where like, there's the threat of like losing birthright citizenship. There's mass deportations happening constantly. And that certainly was not, I wish that wasn't the case, that the book had come to be in this moment.
Right.
Well, and forgive me because this question is forming as I'm talking, but it occurred to me when I was reading the endorsements for your book, one of the very glowing blurbs said this is a literary White Lotus. And I know we had kind of talked about the plus side of having the timing of the Grand Paloma Resort coming out, at one of the amazing seasons of the show. But your book is a lot more than just, kind of fluff and glitter. And I love the White Lotus as much as the next warm-blooded person. But building on what you've been talking about, there's like a real spine of, you talk about touristification, which, and the resort and the effect it has on the people who work there. There's a lot about class. There's a lot about, everything we've already talked about. And I'm wondering if the White Lotus comparison is a little bit of a detractor from the real meat of your book, if you felt that at any point. And then conversely, do you think you've gotten readers who thought they were picking up one kind of book, and then they're like, oh, I'm gonna learn some stuff about, a culture of people I didn't know a lot about. So pick any tendril of that.
No, I mean, I love this question. I love it because, to be honest with you, there's a part of me that has also been as expected, right? Like there have been several critics that have said, I'm riffing off of the White Lotus, or, this is a copycat book. But still, like, I mean, there has been so much positive feedback about how, and it is what it is, but from their perspective, they're saying this is like a better book. White Lotus, come read this book to learn how to do it, right? So I think it's like a huge compliment, because like I said, I think White Lotus is centrally concerned with exposing something about class and privilege that's different than what I'm interested in studying and exposing and illuminating even. And so yeah, I think that one of the ways in which I have been thinking about it a lot, because I've had a few people tag me on Instagram, because bookstagrammers, I love them, but they can be brutal. And so, and a few of them have said, like, I feel so torn. These people are terrible, these employees. And I just feel like, one of the things that I am interested in also exposing is this idea that, like, poor people are good. Like, I think it's just as damaging to think that as thinking the opposite, that all poor people are lazy and bad. Like, I think it's really damaging to, like, cloak people who are poor in this, like, stereotype of purity and like goodness, because the fact is that people make terrible decisions for a lot of reasons, and one of those reasons can be pressure that you feel because of class, because of like a lack of wealth, right? And so I feel really deeply, because I grew up without a lot of money, and now I'm a very different class. I worked in corporate America for 20 years. I married someone who is doing really quite well. And so my husband and I both grew up working class, and we're now like a very different class than we were. And that has exposed for me too, like being an insider outsider of like wealth, is how really different people see each other and don't see each other, how there's like a complete invisibility that happens between the classes and a flattening. And so, there has been that kind of like a gift, I think, that a lot of people have been comparing me or putting my book in list. You should read after you've watched the White Lotus. And I'm just like, I'm never gonna be mad at somebody telling someone else to read my work, regardless of what they're likening it to. And and I do think that if someone wants a beach read and they just want to like bask in something sexy and light, I mean, this isn't that book, right? Like, I wrote a book that I think moves really quickly, that's gripping and compelling, but it's also a book that I want to invite people to think.
Yeah.
And it should be disturbing at points. There are certain things that these people are going through, these employees, that I hope will just like create in people an awareness when you're traveling abroad, or even when you go to hotels here, about the fact that like it is another person on the other side of the food cart, on the other side of the bar. And so, yeah, thank you for that question. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for the very articulate answer. We're kind of free flowing here at Imposter Hour.
Indeed.
Greg, I'll let you take the next one.
Well, now I'm like, I could go in so many different directions and spoke off of that. I mean, it's so much a number of things that kind of gets my brain firing about your book. I mean, I think one of the things that you said, as you say, it's, you don't want to paint the sort of nobility of the impoverished, but I think one of the things that you really key into on both sort of economic tiers is trauma, and how much trauma really plays roles in that. I mean, you mentioned Laura is on this sort of, she's looking after her family and her sister, and she's trying to just get them through. And, they're coming out of a lot of trauma. You also have on the sort of the wealthier guest side, there is, and you don't do any of this, you're not really hitting anything too hard on the nose, but you can imply a lot of trauma. There's almost sort of the shared trauma of capitalism, of this system that everyone's sort of living under and having to navigate. And then there are these kind of like, there's this cognitive dissonance that sort of plays into all of these sort of people's roles as well. There's a great, if you don't mind me quoting the book, there's this great line or this great passage that I love. It's one of the insights Elena had gained into wealthy people, those who'd inherited their money and not worked hard to earn it, was that they had this sense of invincibility, of all-encompassing power, as if money meant that they weren't bound by the rules that other people followed. I think that like sums up so much of where we are in terms of late capitalism and corporatism. And also one of the things in the book that you becomes very central is climate change and climate crisis. And one of the things that I'm always fascinated by is how people have this idea that money will somehow insulate them from climate collapse. I mean, I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that, because it really does become, in many ways, sort of a driving force in the novel.
Yes, I mean, damn, Greg, you got me. You got me whirled up right now, okay? Because it's like so much of what I was hoping people would see. I think the two of you have seen so beautifully. It's such a gift to be here and to be talking to people who love books. Because honestly, like so much of what I was trying to line up was this idea that, you know, the two sides of the island, right? Haiti and Dominican Republic are locked through, you know, this is just what it is. History has made it so.
Right.
Are like dysfunctional siblings, right? Because they're like speaking different languages. It always seems to me when I travel back to the Dominican Republic as a Dominican person that has been raised and educated in the United States. I'm a U.S. citizen. So I come in it with like a different mindset. And when I go back to the Dominican Republic, it seems to me that like, it is an unbridgeable gap where these two countries are. And I'm always thinking like, what made it so, right? And then I think about a history of trauma that the country has, you know? And then I was thinking about this Caribbean, you know, region as like the meeting place of the old world and the new world. I mean, everything that has happened today was enabled because of Christopher Columbus landing in Hispaniola, right? The first place where Columbus landed was the Dominican Republic. And so I think about Hispaniola, I should say, because, you know, historians think it was really in the Haitian side. And so like what I am so interested in thinking about is how, you know, the idea that like the enslavement of people started in this region, right? It would like the Caribbean became a bridge to Latin America, to South America. And like, even though there had been enslaved people in the history of the world before, the way that like the United States just radically changed the way that wealth can be, right, can happen. I mean, this is like a total tangent, but even like the universities now that are reckoning with their own wealth, right? And like, oh, how it's tied, like whose wealth in this country isn't tied to like owning enslaved people? Right. Even Native Americans own enslaved people. You know what I mean? So it's like there's something to me that's so all-encompassing that I was fascinated by it. Then I was thinking about, okay, so how do I animate that? Because just the three of us talking about it, some people might just like switch the radio off right now, right? Because they're like, yawn, who wants to talk about terrible histories of the world? And what I think is even more fascinating is to think about the way that people make these choices, right? Because even wealthy people, and I have been, and it's not like I'm like, you know, the wealthiest person in the world, but I have changed drastically from the class that I was born into, and largely because of vehicles that have been created, right? In the United States, education is available. There's like, you know, there have been programs that aided my family, like food programs that, right? That like made sure that like my brain was functioning well during the times when like my mom couldn't work. And so I just feel like I've been a recipient of this like education. And I feel like really fascinated by this idea that even if you are at the upper level, you are still trapped in a system that is corrosive.
Yes.
And sometimes people don't think it because it's like, is it really that bad being wealthy and being rich? But what ends up happening is that you're like part of this greed system where like no matter how much you have, you want more. And like if you are... So anyway, like the last thing I'll say about this, Greg, is that I love that you brought up the climate crisis, because that's something that like I honestly haven't spoken to anyone about this book. Okay. Is that like there's all these thorny things with the sisters and thorny things about the hotel and like a lot of other sexy things to talk about sex trade, right? Yeah. So people are never like, let's talk about the hurricane, right, you know? But also this idea that like the hurricanes are becoming more and more powerful. Yep. And it's all of it, right, is like largely driven by like these corporations that are symbolic of everything we've been talking about. Yeah. And so when I was thinking about all these characters running around, being ambitious and being caught up in like promotions, well, let a hurricane come, because I've lived through like 2 hurricanes in my life. And when you want to talk about power, yeah. Like there's nothing that's more humbling as a human being than when you live through like a major storm. Yeah. It really makes you like, it chills you the way that like a storm can just flatten and like destroy everything. Yeah. So there's just so many different strands of this that I was thinking about in terms of like, how do we elucidate for people how all of this is like the same conversation? Because sometimes it feels like we're talking about different things when we're talking about inequality.
Yes.
Mm. And when you are thinking about the kind of themes, topics, ideas that you want to integrate into your writing, or when maybe you're teaching and your students are like biting off all of the things, you just mentioned like 5 really big, bold, topics to write about. How do you also stay in the mind of like, I need to make this book move forward? What is the plot? Because I think that there feels often, I feel pressure to and responsibility as a writer. Like if I'm going to write a book, I want to make it worth your while, and I want you to think some thoughts and learn some things, and maybe disagree, but I think it is important to have all of the things you mentioned, critical thinking and history and observation, but also you have a very sexy book and you have really complex, nuanced, problematic characters in the best way. So, Cleyvis, how do you approach maybe first part when you sit down? Is it story first, kind of the topics you want to hit? How is that process? And then second, when you have students who really want to bite off a lot, how do you guide them, advise them on how to kind of find the balance?
Yes, I mean, I love this question, Liz. Thank you so much. I think there's a part of me that has always felt that just because of the way that I grew up, and we have this concept now of intersectionality, which I didn't grow up with as I was coming up and studying, and it seems to me like so wonderful that we now have the language to be able to say that. For me, I don't think about writing social justice literature. Like, honestly, whenever I pick up a book that is marketed as social justice, it's usually a terrible book. Honestly, it's like, oh my God, these people have tried to like talk about domestic violence in this way, and it's the most boring. And also, even if the writing is good, it's just, if you're leading with a social justice idea, I think your book is dead in the water. Because like an idea will not drive a story. I just don't think it does. I think people drive stories. And I feel really fortunate because, like I said, I mean, I worked a corporate job for 20 years. I grew up, there were times in my life in the Dominican Republic when we were food insecure. I grew up in a situation where like I felt like my mom was really trapped in a relationship with a person. My father had stayed behind in DR. And so my mom was trapped in a situation where largely, I think, at least in the beginning, because of a financial circumstance, she was stuck in that situation. She had 4 children and really limited means. And so I think like I am so lucky that I have been able to live a life where like a lot of difficult and, at times horrifying things happen to me. But like culturally, I came up in a way where like there was always laughter, there was always love, and so it's not like my life wasn't a tragedy. I mean, maybe some people might think, some of the things I've been through are horrifying, but there's no time in my life where I've thought of myself or anyone in my family as victims. And so, when I set out to write about the world, and I'm, like what I tell my students is, you have to tell the truth about your characters. Like I knew that if someone said to Laura, you have an obligation to like save a town because something terrible is happening, that character would laugh in their face and be like, I'm holding the hand of my sister and getting the hell out of here. That's who she is. And you know what? It's like a thorny, difficult character to write as a protagonist, right? Because she's someone that is so complicated. But there's like a heart that's beating in there. And I thought that, if I drew her fully and well, she would be compelling despite the fact that she has this kind of pebble in her chest instead of a heart, right? And so, that's what I think a lot about is, the story for me is the character. Like I think when I set out to write about these employees in a resort, I've never worked in a resort, right? So I had to go out there and interview like dozens of people to understand that ecosystem. And I'm lucky that I actually, through just traveling and being at bars in different hotels, I've ended up talking to like executives who are like really the highest levels of like running hotels. And like just, I think the world has this way that it conspires to make you a good artist and a good writer, because sometimes people fall in my lap and I'm like, what do you mean that you're like a historian for Curacao? I'm just about to start writing a book about Curacao and I've never been there. So, I think that if you stay awake in life and you talk to people and you engage in like a meaningful way, there are these opportunities when you can like really learn about the world and then have that. And sometimes it means you have to do the work. I went back to the Dominican Republic very intentionally and interviewed Dominicans of Haitian descent because I didn't know any. I mean, I didn't grow up around a lot of people who were living that situation or who had gotten deported. And so I had to go and like make those connections so that I knew how to have that knowledge influence the book in a meaningful way. And so I think for me, a lot of it has to do with like being intentional about being educated, being knowledgeable. I mean, maybe educated isn't even the right word. It's just being knowledgeable about what you're attempting to do. And then really having whatever it is that you're trying to say come through your characters. Because like a reader can tell bullshit, right? Like a reader can tell if you're trying to teach them a lesson. And that's the most boring. It makes me crazy. Anytime I pick up a book, honestly, and I feel like, don't be didactic with me. I'm a grown up. I choose what I want to learn about. You know what I mean? And so for me, it's like if I want a reader to be exposed to something that they might not be otherwise exposed to, it has to come through a character is somehow wrestling with that same thing.
Right. I have to imagine just, just the way you've sort of described your upbringing and then your sort of experiences in life and the way you've kind of been out in the world and been exposed to a lot of things. I have to imagine that also helps with character in terms of, having experienced both sides of like the economic line and being out and absorbing all of this stuff. I mean, I have to imagine all of that together helps bring the kind of empathy and compassion that you're able to bring to those characters on the page when you're really trying to lock into character.
That's right. But also like, I'm a sexy person, right?
Sure.
Like, I'm someone who's like, I don't know about you, but I really like sex.
Sure, yeah,
So like, when I think about like the kind of fiction I want a world that feels alive,
Yeah.
and like my characters want to party. They want to have good drinks, I don't make criminal decisions. So let me just lead with that because there's a lot of criminality happening in this book. But I also feel like, I think so much of who I am, I want to bring into my fiction.
Yeah.
And I think there's like just different conduits to like engage with it. And and to like really try to create a delicious experience, but like a full experience. Because I want like my reader to walk away from the book and to like really be torn about these two sisters because they're kind of awful people.
Right.
And so it's like, like by the end, I want your heart to beat for them. And I want you to like think about forgiveness. Like, do you forgive these two women what they have done? And if you don't forgive them, or if you do forgive them, I want you to look outward into the world and think about what that means in the broader world. Yeah. That's really my biggest hope.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, Greg and my favorite thing to write about together and separately is terrible people who you root for in the end. So this is one of the many reasons why we're huge fans of yours. And, to grease you up a little bit more, I can't find where in your life you could be an imposter or have imposter syndrome, because your writing feels so confident and effortless in how you speak, and I'm sure your students feel this way. So do you feel ever like an imposter, or have you? I mean, tip me over with a feather.
Well, I have to, first of all, thank you very much for your kindness. What I have to tell you is that I remember I was invited to be on a panel about imposter syndrome for the Association of Writers and Writing Programs 2 years ago. And I was trying to explain to people how, I came to be like an imposter late in life because, I had been brought up as a writer to think like the world is gonna roll out a red carpet because you're talented. And I work really hard at everything I do. I'm just like a really hard worker, and I thought that like, oh, if you're talented and a hard worker, how can I not be the queen of like all books, and like the fact is that it was crushing for me when I tried to create a writing career. I mean, there was just nothing but crushing rejection for like decades, you know what I mean? And so I think like the beating that I took was that for me, like, and I used to have this big joke in my corporate job where I would tell people like I suffer from high self-esteem instead of low self-esteem, because I would be like, have you met someone that's smarter? Have you met someone who's sexier? Like I would just go around talking this way, and people always understood that there's like a warmth that comes to me, but also that like I'm confident because I work hard for what I do, right? Like I work hard to write a good book. It doesn't come easy, right? It's all labor. And so, yeah, I think that sense of being an imposter for me really came about because like the world wasn't accepting what I was putting out. Like there was just no way. And I think that there was a moment where I had to face the fact that I wasn't being authentic, that like the books I was writing was trying to please like like a critic, or trying to please kind of like my old professors, and that I wasn't writing with the passion or with the wisdom that I've earned through life. And then I think for me, like the turning point really being like, I think I deserve to be here and I deserve to find a path to achieve my dreams, was because I decided that I needed to be my truest self on the page as well as in life. I had been compartmentalizing myself so that like there was like a writer Cleyvis and a corporate Cleyvis and like a family Cleyvis, right? And then at one point I was like, there can be no division, right? Like the power that I have as a human being and the power that I can bring to the page is by kind of combining these things. Right. And it was really like painful, and like I was in despair for so long because it isn't easy to like combine yourselves. The world tells us a lot of time that to be respected and to be taken seriously, you have to present, speak, be a certain way. And I'm always asked, even this day, I just had a conversation with a friend of mine last week that I was like, do you think I would be more successful if I was more serious? Should I try to be less funny? Like I'm like a 48-year-old woman, and I'm like, should I change who I am to be successful? So it's not like it goes away. I don't think that like having these questions about who we are and feeling, even me, and I'm a confident person, and I still have these moments where I'm like, am I somehow damaging my work, or like the way that the work could be read and understood if I just presented myself in a different way? Right. I don't know if that makes sense, but I still ask myself that all the time. Like, am I a good representative of my work? Am I doing the best I could for it? Right. And I don't know. How do we ever know what the answer is for that?
Right. It's a good point. Well, to your point, authenticity is key. Maybe that's the thing. If you're just presenting yourself authentically on all of those fronts, what more or what better or else could you do? This has come up. It's part of the theme of the book itself, but it's also come up kind of organically just in our conversation. And it gets me wondering, part of what you talk about in the novel is the idea of blood family versus chosen family or community, and how those things sort of, sometimes weave together in terms of someone's sort of, support system and community and all that kind of stuff. And I think with creatives, with writers, community can always be such a big, driving force for us, or a support system, or something that we feel like, we can glean some comfort and security. And how does community sort of in a creative sense, inform your life and your process?
Well, I think my experience with being part of a community of writers has been like, so illuminating too in so many different ways, because when I was coming up and I went to my MFA program, I was working a full-time job at the time. And I just remember like being around my writer friends was like being part of this like incredible family. And it was like chosen family, and like we would nerd out about books and drink wine till all hours of the day. And you felt like a writer just being around each other, even though you hadn't published anything. Right. You know what I mean? But then we graduated, and a lot of my friends started getting book deals, started doing quite well, professionally. And like my engine just had stalled. Like, I got ghosted by an agent, another agent was just incompetent. And I was very young, and I felt a lot of shame. Like I felt like I don't know how to ask for help, or I didn't want people to know that things weren't going so well. And so what ended up happening for me is that I like withdrew from the community. And I kind of like, I was like, well, maybe I'm better off and I'll do better on my own. And, you know, it took me like, again, because I'm like older in life, I can say this now because I hope like maybe it'll be of use to someone else, is that it took me a really long time to face the fact that like I cannot grow as a writer on my own. Like, I think part of it is cultural, right? But I think part of it is just who I am at my core. Teaching makes me a better writer. Being around other writers and listening to other writers talk about writing makes me a better writer. Interviewing writers, you know, I love moderating talks because like I always learn a lot from like, how do I get someone to tell me exactly how they did it because they're brilliant and I want to steal their ideas, you know, like. And so there's like something to me that is like really ignites my imagination and ignites my own skill, right? And I level up, but it took a long time to kind of divorce myself of that shame of being like, oh, you're not gonna be this kind of like ferocious star out the gate, right? And so I think that once I kind of like came to terms with the fact that my career, just based on like the combination of that, like the shame of failure and then like the shame of having to start over again and learn again, you know, like once I was like, okay, I'm just gonna have to set that aside because what I gained by being a student for the rest of my life is this internal growth that makes me so happy. And so I came back, and, you know, and coming back is so humbling because when I started, you know, about 7 years ago, I remember going to like Bread Loaf and Juniper. And, you know, I got over that. I was 40 years old and I was like, you gotta be freaking kidding me. I'm around all these 20-year-olds, you know? But then there were so many people that were like in their 40s and 50s and 60s and beyond, like people who are professionals and people who have said, I'm not necessarily here because I want a book deal. I'm here because I love writing and I love this life. And so in some ways, I feel like it was like such a beautiful gift to come back, you know, with that kind of, I was, you know, very hesitant, and I didn't know how I would feel, but then like very quickly I created like a new life out of that. And then I went back to some of those old friendships, you know, and those are like some of my best friends now. Cause I'm like, well, it's okay for people to be ahead of you. It's okay for people to have more success. Like, again, this is capitalism that makes us crazy and makes us competitive because we feel like if you're better than me, I don't want to be your friend. Like, are you kidding me? How else do we grow unless we like welcome people? And I think the other thing that I'll say, and I'm so grateful for this conversation and to be having it with other writers, is that, you know, I do feel in my heart that like it takes a few years, I think, living as a writer to understand that some of it is just dumb luck. You know what I mean? And it's like, and I don't know what your ancestors did that is giving you better karma. I don't know, but I have to believe that like if you're a shitty person and wonderful things are happening for you, maybe someone else was deserving in your lineage. Because there have been times when I see people and I'm like, the things that like the world offers them, it isn't always of their doing. And you also have to understand that the converse is true, that you could be working hard and deserving and that some things might just not be available. And you have to make peace of that with that. Otherwise, you're going to be miserable, you know?
Good point.
Cleyvis, I'm going to listen to this episode every day while I'm trying to finish my book. This has been so inspiring, and you've said so many things. I feel emotional, but I'm just really grateful. You know, you reminded me of all of the reasons that I love writers and why we're doing this podcast. So thank you. And I'm also miserable that somehow that was the fastest hour of our life. But can you quickly tell us if you're working on anything new and what can we look forward to and wait for with bated breath?
Well, I'm so excited that I've sold my third book.
Yes.
And it is part of this Paloma universe. So the next book, I've sold. I haven't written it yet, so I don't know. I think you and I, Liz, might have to get into a group chat to inspire each other to show up one more day. But yeah, so the new book takes place in Curacao, which is an island in the Caribbean that I have not visited. So I'm very excited to like learn about this island. It's history is really interesting. It's intertwined with the Dominican Republic in a really interesting way. And so I'm gonna like give myself some homework to learn a lot about finances and other things that I want to write about. But I think the best part about this next book is that it's about medical tourism. And so I have been researching the stuff people do, go to other countries to do. Like we're all like, oh yeah, people go to Turkey for hair plugs. Right. Let me tell you the kind of crazy stuff people do. I'm so excited to write this book, and now I have to like, figure out whether or not all these crazy hours I'm spending learning about all these weird procedures are even going to make it into the book. But it's been a lot of fun to like think about it and start kind of building the world.
Amazing.
Oh my God, please put all the weird procedures in the book.
Please do. That we cannot wait for that book. That is amazing. Cleyvis, thank you again so much for spending your time with us, for sharing your afternoon. Before we do let you go, could you let people out there know where to find you on social media or out in the world?
Yes, I would love to be connected with all of you on Instagram. I'm Cleyvis Natera there, and that's where I'm most active. Okay. I do have a website that I try to keep pretty up to date with like events information. I'll be, touring and visiting different universities and bookstores over the next few months. So, I'd love to meet people. If you read the book, even if you don't like it, I want to hear from you, especially if you don't like it. I want you to tell me why. Send me an email. My email is available on my website, cleyvisnatera.com.
Great.
Wow, you are brave. Well, I will take us out. Impostor Hour with Liz and Greg is created and hosted by us, Elizabeth Keenan and Greg Wands. The show is produced and edited by Bookwild Collective founder Kate Hargett, and Scott Leeds composed our original theme music, and Steve Luama designed our logo.
And you can find us on IG at Impostor Hour Podcast and online at impostorhour.com. Thanks for listening.